The Secretary of Defense is going on an unusual campaign, calling every single admiral and general to personally meet him in Quantico, Virginia. Just why is a meeting like this unbelievably weird? And also, why is it even weirder to hear the administration try to explain it away? Plus, we're going to talk about what could really be going on, from the most troubling all the way down to the most stupid. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this has been a weird story, right? Now, reportedly, the Pentagon chief has ordered all U.S. military admirals and general level officers, from everyone from the Space Force to the Army to the Marine Corps to the Navy, to fly from around the globe to Virginia next week for some kind of meeting. Now, this is, of course, bad for a number of reasons. First off, this is almost never happened. And it's almost never happened on this short a notice. And it's almost never happened with no agenda given. Why is it weird and a problem? Well, first off, most obviously, is that when you take all of your general level leaders and you put them in a single room, you create both a massive target for America's enemies. If you're someone like China, you may look and say, listen, we can cripple the U.S. military. We can cleave off their entire leadership tier with a single strike or a single poisoning or a single incident. It may be seen as too juicy a target to turn down for a country, again, of means like China or Russia. Of course, you also present a massive intelligence gathering opportunity because you have every single general engaging in every single kind of operation in one place. If you could tap into every cell phone signal coming out of there, if you could tap into every internet cable flowing out of Quantico, you could literally see from a single point in time the entire U.S. military operations, because every single thing the U.S. military does somewhere feeds into a general officer. And we're talking about up to 1,000 attending here. But so that itself makes it pretty weird. Also, FYI, every U.S. military operation feeds through a general officer. So somewhere there's a general officer who wakes up every day in South Korea and looks at the North and goes, what are they up to today? And he or she supervises that effort in a close, intimate, careful way. There's generals who wake up every day and say, how do we make sure that we get satellite data that Ukraine can use to hit targets today, right? There are admirals who wake up every day and say, how do we make sure that our allies have the naval support that we need? How do we make sure that naval ships, that civilian traffic moves through key dangerous areas, right? There are admirals who today are commanding the forces that are keeping the Red Sea clear of Houthi strikes. All of those people are being pulled from their duties with almost no notice, right? Remember, a admiral's and general schedule is a CEO, is akin to like a CEO. They are scheduled weeks and months ahead of time. A typical admiral's chief of staff is seen as so sophisticated and the staff so wide-reaching that that officer themselves is often a lieutenant colonel or above. And this is, so to throw a wrench in them at 1 week notice is pretty wild. Now, I want to be clear. The Secretary of Defense has every right to call a general and say, you will meet with me. That's how the chain of command works. And what I thought was most interesting is actually there is no information, zero information being put out about what this meeting is for, which is so bizarre. Again, not something that the Secretary of Defense is required to give to generals, right? They serve under him. And if he says, you will meet with me, they say, yes, sir. That is how civilian control of the military works. But part of the way it goes down is that you don't usually call these kind of meetings unless there is something grave and emergent, usually. But there's nothing usual about this administration. So here's another story that I thought was really bizarre. And this is when the White House was asked about it. So JD Vance said that the meeting was not unusual. He says, listen, it's not weird. The Vance said, quote, it's not particularly unusual that generals who report to the Secretary of War and into the President of the United States are coming to speak with the Secretary of War. It's not unusual at all, and I think it's odd that you guys are making it such a big story. And this is a classic JD Vanceism. Yeah, it is true. If you are a 3 or 4 star general, for sure, you are probably in very regular monthly contact with the Secretary of Defense or like a Deputy Secretary of Defense. That is totally normal. And you may be in direct contact with the president. Famously, Stanley McChrystal would be in regular contact directly from the president himself. But this is not each individual general receiving orders from the president. Remember, even some of the most, even Stanley McChrystal getting fired by Obama was not done in person. It was done via a secure conference call because General McChrystal was leading the fight in Afghanistan. And he couldn't be fired right away, right? You couldn't simply abandon the post and then have the president find his replacement later. There had to be a transition period. It was important. And so the fact that these generals, it is not unusual for them to meet with the White House. It is not unusual for them to be in regular communication with the White House. It is very unusual for them to have their time, I don't want to use the word disrespected, but kind of disrespected by saying, listen, you have to get on a flight, multiple flights. You have to travel for 24, 48 hours to get to Quantico, and we won't even tell you why. So you can't even prepare, right? Because what if the Secretary of Defense has questions for these generals? They might want to say, how many troops are in your command? How many civilians do you command? How ready are you for a government shutdown? Well, the generals aren't going to be able to even answer that question without some kind of preparation, some kind of agenda. And so you're like, okay, well, this is going to be a one-way communication. So then why can't it be an email or a memo? And this is the mystery. This is the weird part. What message is going to be communicated solely in one way from the top down? Because again, the generals have no opportunity or time to prepare their own questions or their own information. So it's not going to be a back and forth. This isn't going to be, hey, let's get everyone together and solve a problem and reach a consensus. Because if that were the case, they would have an agenda. They'd say again, listen, we've got this government shutdown coming. We need to make sure all our commands are fully prepared. So I want you to make sure you know the number of civilians, what your payroll looks like, how you would do operations if all the civilians had to go home, all of this stuff. None of that is being provided to these guys. So now we got to ask, and I'm going to put on my government auditor hat because, as you guys know, I spent 7 years as an auditor at the Department of Homeland Security doing very high level, very sensitive. Really, I'm using the word auditor, but it wasn't quite that either. It was a different thing. The title was senior inspector, and it meant that I wouldn't do financial statements alone, and I wouldn't do criminal wrongdoing alone. We did stuff like this, right? This would be exactly something that would get assigned. And I have done stuff like this. So why do these things happen? So let's start at the top. One, I think the most likely explanation is stupidity. Or rather, I'm not going to say stupidity, but a poorly thought out power play in which the Secretary of Defense feels, for one reason or another, that he doesn't have control of his generals, that his generals don't respect him, or that his generals are operating in ways he doesn't like, and he wants to assert his authority over them. And to assert his authority, he is proving that he can order them into a single place at a single time. This is something that happens often in small unit leadership situations. Again, when you have a bunch of 19-year-old privates, sometimes those privates get a little fail to respect your authority as the officer. And so you have to do stuff like this to remind them, I am the officer, and this is you. I have a level of authority that you would be wise to remember. Now, if you're a 18, 19-year-old private, this is a message that you need to get sometimes. I'll tell you that my team leaders, especially like more senior guys who were in their like 30s, team leaders and above, they almost never needed this kind of check, right? Usually that would be like a conversation, pull aside where you go, hey man, front of the guys, you cannot question me this way. You need to do it next time. You pull me aside. You say, hey, sir, have you thought about that? And I go, okay, right? Or, hey, you can raise questions, but you can't frame it this way. You've got to have deference to the rank. All those conversations you can do, again, with a 30-year-old team leader, you can definitely assert your authority other ways, more appropriate ways, with a general who has 20 to 30 years of experience. So that's a little weird. That's my first theory, because we've seen stuff like this from Pete Hegseth or from Trump himself, who sort of operates with this sort of weird personal way. The more troubling likelihood is something that I did see a lot when I would do audits, is that, or the things I was doing. And that would be, orders are going to be given for which no record can exist. So here's the problem with a phone call, particularly a secret phone call, right? Let's say you call somebody, your plan is to call these generals and to issue them orders that you don't want there to be a public record of. You don't want a nosy reporter to be able to file a Freedom of Information Act request. You don't want a staffer to hear it and go, oh my God, I can't believe they issued this order. You don't want you don't want there to be a lawsuit or a court case in which a person can testify and say, hey, I was an IT specialist on this phone call and I saw these things I heard these orders being issued. And again, or you don't want to have a lawyer go, hey man, the way the terms that you gave for this order, if it was, for example, written in a memo, are highly illegal. You cannot give this kind of order. And so what you do is you communicate things verbally on a person-to-person basis. And I've seen this. We used to see it a lot in Border Patrol, where they would get orders that were not in compliance with law or regulation, or with even the union contract, and you wouldn't know what the actual order was, but you could infer it because you would say, hey, the headquarters gathered all their people, and then everybody left. No one officially, there was no documentation of what took place here. There was no meeting notes. There was no agenda. But afterward, every single subordinate station suddenly began to change their policy in the exact same way. And you would say, again, the investigator in me would go, okay, well, clearly an order was given here because every one of you guys came to the same independent conclusion immediately after a meeting with your superior, a meeting in which no notes were issued, right? And as I always would point out, the people who get screwed by that are not the leadership. The leadership goes, we never gave an order. The people who execute those orders that are illegal or against policy or against regulation or against some kind of agreement the government has made, they are the ones who bear full responsibility. And so for me, the worst case scenario is that these generals are going to be all given an order and they are going to be told something that there cannot be a written record for, that the government does not want a nosy reporter, a Freedom of Information Act, a lawsuit to go out and to reveal what was said or discussed in this order. Now, this is also sort of the government being comically inept because 800 generals, someone's going to leak something somewhere because you're going to have generals that are, I'm using the word generals to include generals and admirals. Technically, the term is flag grade officer, but flag grade officers includes colonels. We're using the word generals here. But technically, remember, 800 generals, you're going to have people who range from in total absolute agreement with you and in total absolute contradiction. And this is part of a functioning military, is that you want senior staff that range from incredibly have a strong moral sense of their own, what is an immoral order, what is an unethical order. They're going to ask lots of questions. You want people who are in strong support of your policies and policy directions, and you want them all to offer input because that's how good decisions get made in a government, with lots and lots of input and perspective. So I think it's also probably naive to say that this is a good plan. There's also a bunch of other weird shit where they say, hey, we're going to prepare for a war with Venezuela. something that the administration has been sort of jonesing for on a level that's a little weird and off-putting. I think that's possible, and they may say, hey, we don't want to even communicate this. It's too secret. It's too sensitive. Which would also, but that would also fit in the level of something you don't want there to be a written record for. Because as we talked about, if you thought the Iraq War was founded on false premises, the U.S. has no substantive conflict with Venezuela that warrants military action. It just doesn't. And that's not even me talking. On this channel, we reviewed the DEA's report from 2024, and Venezuelan drug trafficking gangs made almost no appearance. There was a brief aside in terms of the volume of drugs brought into the country. So this is weird, and I refuse to believe it isn't. And the weird thing that I thought, there was a line by the president who says, why don't you want, when asked about it, the president said, well, why don't you want the generals to all get along? Which is weird, which implies that this is actually some sort of meant to be some kind of kumbaya, or some kind of bring everyone together and get them on the same page, or get them to get along, or get them on the agenda. And this itself is troubling because it implies that a lot of generals are saying, hey, you're asking me to do things that I don't agree with. And so it's possible that it could have some kind of ideological purge elements that say, listen, we're the U.S. military. We've decided, the White House has decided we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And some generals may be like, yo, you're coming dangerously close to orders that are illegal, immoral, or unethical. And remember, it doesn't matter what U.S. law says. The UCMJ requires all military members, from officers down to privates, to not follow orders that are illegal, which is actually pretty easy to determine, but also immoral or unethical, right? So if I was to tell my soldiers, hey, we are going to put only female soldiers on guard duty all the time, legally, I would have every authority to do that, right? But it would be unethical for me to do so, to discriminate against female soldiers, to give them additional duty only solely because they're female. That would be unethical, right? In contrast, if I was to say, and I did do this, right? If I was to do the opposite, say, hey, we're in Afghanistan. When we put soldiers on guard duty, they have an Afghan partner. That Afghan partner is always male. And a number of female soldiers have said, hey, the Afghans, when I'm on guard duty with them, sometimes they make me uncomfortable. They say and do things that I think might mean I'm in danger. And I go, okay, we're having that policy, but reversed. Only males do guard duty, and female soldiers are going to do like other duties that don't put them in close contact with Afghan males. Well, that is the same order. It is legal, but it is also ethical, and it is moral because it is protecting soldiers from harm, right? And so that is the obligation that a lot of these generals are also subject to. They have to rely on their internal moral compass to determine when an order is ethical and moral and when it is done for reasons that they cannot support. And they are required by law to refuse to follow those orders. And the question is that what's going to be issued here at this? We're all going to find out. Anyway, if you want to help out the Ukrainian military in their fight against the Russians, we have a huge fundraiser going on with Ukraine Aid Ops, helping out units that I've personally met on the front lines. Guys like the 93rd, the 25th Azov, 79th, SOF, 82nd Liu. All of these guys are top tier units, some of the best of the best. And we are getting them the gear they need to hold the Russians back in the East. And best of all, an anonymous donor has agreed to match us dollar for dollar for every dollar we raise. We are so close to that $300,000 threshold. And a huge thank you. We've had so many big donors, big and small donors. That's the cool part, right? There's a bunch of donors that don't even appear on the wall, but look at Dylan, $1,000, nearly $600 from Albert, $150 from Robert, Miranda, $103, Eric, $400, James Bannis, $100. I mean, look at these guys. Jeffrey donating $1,000 Canadian. These guys are true bad dudes. Adam donating in memory of Charlotte. Rest in peace. $400, even $12 from Kai. This is awesome stuff, guys. And this makes a real difference for these units. It's literally a life or death struggle. Units, guys, Ukrainian soldiers are going to come home because of what we do for these guys. So link is in the description. Of course, if you want to support me personally and the channel and the team here at the channel, because advertisers don't want to touch anybody who's critical of the administration right now, and I try to call it like I see it, you can become a member at Combat Vet News. It helps me out a lot. The link to that is also in the description. Thanks to our Colonel tier members, AL90, James Poor, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alex, William, and Henry Russier, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. Thank you, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.